Good afternoon. We are ready to start the second panel in this amazing World Congress organized for us and for the enforced disappeared. I would like to thank the ICJ for a very interesting previous panel on accountability. And now we move to the empowerment of victims of enforced disappearances. And it has been the privilege of the United Nations Voluntary Fund for Victims of Torture to sponsor this panel. And that brings me to mention that the general call for applications, I mentioned the emergency call for Syria this morning, but the general call for applications for the fund opens today until 1st of March. So obviously we hope for a lot of qualified applications addressing the needs of victims, as we already mentioned. The issue of empowering victims takes as its point of departure the concept of redress. And as you may know, the General Assembly in 2005 adopted the principles that applies to victims of gross human rights violations, the principles that we also know as Van Boven-Bassiouni principles. And this is a matter of restitution, of compensation, rehabilitation, satisfaction, and guarantees of no repetition. I'm sure most of you are familiar with these principles. The UN Committee Against Torture has elaborated the concept of rehabilitation, and they have done so in a general comment on the right to rehabilitation according to the Convention Against Torture. And this right makes it clear that rehabilitation is not just treatment. It's also treatment, maybe it's medical support, it's psychological support, but it's a holistic approach that is tailor-made to the single victim entitled to this redress. And the aim is not only to treat the symptoms, the aim is to restore function and actually to restore your life project. And this restoration of function is, again, not only that you have function in your own house, it's also the function that you have to take part in society as a citizen. And perhaps that brings us back to a remark from this morning, from victim to activist. And in fact, this is the process that we will deal with in this panel. And I am privileged of being able to present four very strong practitioners and fighters and women that have immense experience with this field, and they are going to share this with us. And the panel is divided into two. So we have the first hour here, and then we'll switch, and my colleague Angkhana will moderate the second panel. The first presenter that I would like to introduce is Ms. Hala ELKARIB, who is a Sudanese advocate for democracy, and she is a known figure in African feminism with more than 2 decades of experience in Sudan, South Sudan, Eastern Africa, and the Horn of Africa. Hala has engaged extensively with international and regional development and humanitarian institutions, concentrating on the conditions of women and girls in conflict and in post-conflict settings, as well as women's social and economic rights and the experiences of women residing in militant and militarized areas. In her capacity as the regional director of the Strategic Initiative for Women in the Horn of Africa, the so-called SIHA network, Hala contributes to the advancement of rights and empowerment for women and girls within the region. She is a renowned figure in civil society, an analyst, an essayist, contributing to both international and national media outlets. So it's my privilege to introduce Hala and to ask the first question. Would you please, Hala, explain how are women and girls affected by enforced disappearances during Sudan's war? Please.
Thank you very much, and it's such an honor to be here and to speak about such a complex and horrendous issue that we found ourselves confronted with. And I really have to admit that despite my long-term activism and works on human rights and women's rights in the region, I have not been, and my organization, the organization I work for, have not been extensively confronted with the issue of enforced disappearances until the current war in Sudan has erupted in April 15 in 2023, where we found ourselves, have to deal with the extensive challenge of women completely disappearing, where nobody could trace where they are. And unfortunately, we didn't have the resources, or and the support. The Sudan war is, although being one of the worst human rights and humanitarian crises, in my view, that is happening at this point in time, even compared to really massive scale crises in different parts of the world, it's one of the most neglected as well crises, and one of the least crisis that's been for human rights and humanitarian efforts that's been supported, totally abandoned. So we had to navigate, and accumulate learning on our own, and still, the level of support and outreach is beyond limited. So basically, the current war in Sudan, it's a war that is happening, not at the peripheries, it's happening, it started right at the heart of big cities. And the war started in the capital, and this is where we recorded, the larger number of women who completely disappeared. Also, the pattern of, enforced disappearances, I would say 90%, it happened in territories and areas that was under the control of the rapid support forces, the paramilitary that's waged the war against the Sudanese National Army, and at some point, of course, they were part of the National Army, but, they just, kind of assumed that they could take control of the country. And so they've, and this is not new. The RSF, they have done that in Darfur for the past 20 years, where they abducted women and they kept them in, in certain territories, and they, literally enslaved them. And I'm very sure many of you are quite familiar with the case of Darfur, which is, under the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court since 2008, yet there is no progress that is being taking place despite the ongoing atrocities and crime that kept happening in the region. Another indicator is to what extent Sudan's questions is not being prioritized. So working on documenting specifically, the enforced disappearances of women and girls in a closed society, a society that's, not quite, they don't there is no quite clear understanding of the concept of enforced disappearances, and where women are struggling with the burden of shame and families and communities, it's extremely a complex issue. The reporting is very minimal. The status of the rule of law is very miserable. And so we had to rely sometimes on open sources where reports would come out about, social media, about women not being found. And we start initiating communications with families. But then eventually when the families start to realize, what happens, and that most of the time women or girls are taken by the RSF, they would rather claim, that their daughters or wives or sisters has been dead, rather than, acknowledging or admitting that, they have been taken. And we track, testimonies, from witnesses about women who were kept in specific, jails where they, perform, they have been exposed to sexual slavery. They have been performing forced labor and domestic work, for the soldiers. And also we had some information about women that has been trafficked across the borders. But we don't have, the capacity or the resources to do, proper investigation. So, our work so far is limited to documenting, as much as possible, the cases of enforced disappearances, and to find out, what type of support we could extend to the families and how far the families are willing to go in terms of legal remedies.
Thank you very much. Could you perhaps tell us how you have managed to overcome all those difficulties about silence, forgotten conflict, and the fact that you cannot track the women directly?
Well, we have been doing awareness as much as we can. And we have been trying to educate communities about the fact that, this is a crime. And my organization also works on sexual violence. And enforced disappearance is largely linked to sexual slavery, but not necessarily. It's about sexual violence and sexual slavery. There is incidents of women that were found, they were held for over a year in specific territories within the capital, and it happened that the military situation has changed, and then Sudan armed forces entered the area, the women were released, and it turned out that they were actually kept to perform hard labors for the militia, including cooking, washing clothes, carrying arms from one place to the other. So there is all kinds of reasons, there is also a specific targeting of younger girls by the RSF, and that's quite common. I would say more than 40% of the cases that we have documented, it involves girls under the age of 18 years old. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, Hala. Very interesting. We now move to Elba BENDO. On the left, who is a lawyer based in London, working for the European Human Rights Advocacy Center, the EHRAC. They produced the fascinating, scary video that we saw in the beginning of the introduction here that pinpointed the feelings of relatives in connection with enforced disappearances. EHRAC, other than that, is a strategic litigation center that is collaborating with lawyers from Armenia, Azerbaijan, Georgia, Russia, and Ukraine to bring cases of grave human rights violations before international courts and mechanisms. Elba leads the EHRAC's work on addressing enforced disappearances perpetrated by Russian security forces in the North Caucasus region. In this capacity, Elba has represented victims of enforced disappearances in litigation before the European Court of Human Rights and UN treaty bodies, and in advocacy before the Council of Europe and UN special procedures. She has also headed the development of EHRAC's enforced disappearance legal database, which contains the leading international jurisprudence and legal standards on the law of enforced disappearances. So it's my pleasure to introduce Elba with the question of, given your long history of representing victims before the court, the European Court, what are some of the lessons that you have taken from that work? Please.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here today and to be on this panel. At EHRAC, we've represented victims of enforced disappearances from a number of the countries where we work, but the vast majority of cases are from the North Caucasus region. These are disappearances that were perpetrated by Russian state security forces against the North Caucasus communities, particularly the Chechen community. And they were perpetrated largely during the two Russian-Chechen wars. Along with Memorial Human Rights Center, we've represented 96 disappeared victims before the European Court of Human Rights. There's believed to be around 7,000 victims that were disappeared during the two war periods. In terms of some of the positive outcomes from this litigation, the first one is that in each of our cases, the state found the court found the state responsible for the disappearances. We heard from victims that this was an important finding in a context where more than 2 decades since these disappearances were initiated, the state continues to deny responsibility for these crimes. The court judgment and the litigation also created an official record of the early days of the disappearance, the abduction of the victims, and in some cases, the early days they spent in secret detention. In some of the cases, perpetrators were also named, as were federal security forces. The court also found systemically that criminal investigations were flawed, and significantly, it made a significant finding that the way that criminal investigations were run led to an acute sense of helplessness and confusion among victims. I think this is a really important finding that speaks to the universal experience of relatives of disappeared victims, which is the re-traumatization that comes with having to go to the very same authorities that are complicit in your loved one's disappearance to seek answers. Despite these findings, though, what the court was not able to give these victims was any information about their loved one, which was the primary reason that they brought this case forward. And to this day, the fate of all 96 disappeared victims remains unknown. In terms of learnings from this litigation, a few I wanted to highlight for this panel because they speak to how can we support victims in securing their rights are, first, there is real value to international litigation, particularly where domestic mechanisms are unavailable or unsafe. But we have to work closely with victims so that they understand what can this litigation provide, what can it not provide, what risks there are with the litigation, and also what implementation looks like and how long it can take. This way, victims can make an informed decision about how they want to allocate their resources, including their time and their energy. A second learning is that it'll come as no surprise that from all the victims we work with, we heard that the determination of the fate of the victim and more information around what search efforts had been undertaken was the primary focus of the litigation for them and what they sought from the litigation. I think as legal representatives, we need to take that priority seriously, and from the outset of litigation, push decision makers to undertake a rigorous assessment of the search efforts that states have taken, and match those efforts against international best practice, international legal standards, in the same way that courts and decision makers assess criminal investigations. That assessment should also be happening around the search for victims. And finally, our litigation has led us to develop what we call our trauma-informed legal practice guide, which is a set of recommendations and ideas for lawyers working with victims of human rights violations that calls on lawyers to consider the impact of trauma on victims' ability to secure their rights, to work actively to reduce re-traumatization through building communication that is trauma-informed, but also through building relationships with non-legal organizations so that victims can be wrapped around in the support that is available. I think that wraparound support and holistic support can really impact the ability of a victim to participate in legal proceedings. It can also help reduce the re-traumatization that comes with engaging with legal proceedings.
Thank you very much. And the trauma-informed lens or approach is of course close to the buzzwords today, a victim-centered or survivor-centered approach, which would bring us to more psychosocial support. But before doing that, I would like to ask you that you have developed this enforced disappearance legal database, which is the first and only legal database containing the jurisprudence, law, and legal standards and domestic legal mechanisms on the crime of enforced disappearances. We would appreciate if you could tell us a little bit about the database and how it can be useful and perhaps even a best practice that others might be inspired to pursue.
Of course. So this is our enforced disappearance legal database. It was also a byproduct of this litigation. I think it was pulled together to allow legal representatives, but also victims who are advocating on their own behalf and their families' behalf and their loved ones' behalf to be able to access learnings from different jurisdictions and be able to include that in their legal advocacy. The database has 3 main pages. The first is the jurisprudence page. And this, actually, just before I get into the pages, I just wanted to say that the database is available in 4 languages. That's English, French, Russian, and Spanish. And that's the information in the database, but also what's linked in the database, including the jurisprudence, PDFs, as well as the legal frameworks of the domestic mechanisms I'll speak about. So the jurisprudence database contains over 200 of the leading judgments in international, regional, and domestic courts on the cases of enforced disappearances. You can enter terms to search through the jurisprudence. There's also a filter-based search that allows users to search by country, decision year, keywords which were developed in consultation with international legal experts and are hopefully adaptable to each context, each regional context where disappearances are perpetrated. You can search by key judgment. There's also, because we're getting to such high numbers in the jurisprudence, there's also judgments that are not seen as key judgments, but that are in the jurisprudence. And you can search by the relevant authority. So if you have an idea of the body that has rendered the judgment, you can search that body, and you can search even the specific article under the legislation where you think the violation occurred. The second page is the law and standards page. This provides the legislation, the soft law, and the enforcement mechanisms under the 3 international legal frameworks for enforced disappearances. That's the International and Regional Human Rights Framework, Humanitarian, and Criminal Law. And finally, this is a page that we have just started to proliferate, so it's quite empty right now, but we hope to add a significant number of resources to this page by the end of the year. This is our domestic mechanisms database, and this page includes domestic mechanisms that have been developed at the national level to address the crime of enforced disappearances. That could be criminal, constitutional, and civil legislation, truth and reconciliation mechanisms, reparation frameworks, and so on. It's also searchable through filters, and it includes any treatment, information on any treatment by the UN Committee on Enforced Disappearances, the working group, or other bodies who have commented on the effectiveness and justiciability of these mechanisms. Finally, I wanted to flag this button down here, which is a submission button, because we're trying to proliferate the database, and we want it to be as comprehensive as possible. We have a button that allows users to submit something they've worked on, or a case, or a mechanism that's not featured in the database. It's quite a kind of simple form, so if there's anything that you would like to submit, please do make use of that. You can find the database by searching the EDLD. You can find it on our website, EHRAC, or if by the end of these 2 days, with the vast amount of information you've attained, you forget these two websites, you can also find it linked on the UN Committee on Enforced Disappearances main page.
Thank you very much. Very interesting, big work, useful for many present today. We now move to the more psychosocial part of the support for victims, and it's my pleasure to present Ms. Amina MASOOD JANJUA, who is wife of MASOOD JANJUA and mother of 3, and she holds a Master of Fine Arts and is an accredited lawyer in Pakistan. She founded the Defense of Human Rights and Public Services Trust in 2006 and is serving as its chair. Amina has been advocating, along with victims and members of civil society, to provide truth and justice to victims of human rights violations on a self-help basis since 2005. After the 8th Congress of the Council in Asian Federation Against Involuntary and Enforced Disappearances, the AFAD, in Bangladesh in November 2024, she was elected as the South Asian representative. And I'm also proud to say that Amina's organization has received grants from the Voluntary Fund. Amina, please, why did your organization decide to provide psychosocial support in addition to the legal support you're already providing?
I'm most honored to be here in front of all the dignitaries and commissioners. So my organization, as you introduced, started after the disappearance of my husband. So I would start with the quote of Khalil Gibran, one of the poet. He says that ever has it been that love knows not its own depth until the hour of separation. So actually it all started with love and being separated with the loved one. When you are forcefully separated with your loved one, you are not ready to accept it. And especially the families who are the equal victim of enforced disappearances. When they face all this, the trauma is too much to handle. They are torn apart. Those who had to struggle for their disappeared loved ones were torn apart between anxiety about future and what's going to come up, and also depressed about the past. The act of whatever happened, the way it was taken away, their love was taken away. So for that matter, it was important for us to focus on the psychosocial angle and to give direct assistance to the victims of torture and to victims of enforced disappearances. So the main challenges which the families feel are, that there's uncertainty, which is the worst torture, I would say. Because you don't know the whereabouts, you don't know what crime he has done, when he will be coming back, where he is kept. So this gives not even the emotional distress, but PTSD, which is the post-traumatic stress disorder faced by the victims of enforced disappearance and their families. So when they have to search and do the struggles, the mental stress and the emotional stress, these conditions weaken their struggle, and that is one reason why we opted for this psychosocial support. Then there's importance about truth, because they wanted to know the truth at every cost. If anything can give them comfort and that is truth, if they know where their loved ones are. So while they are getting the truth and justice, we have to make them comfortable and mentally fit to carry on the struggle. For that matter, it was important for us to continue with psychosocial therapies, which start with the group sessions, and then gradually, when their trust level is increased, then we go for one-on-one with the help of trained psychologists and therapists. Our therapies are also tailor-made for the victims of enforced disappearance, because the children are the worst impacted. And children, the normal strategy, normal kind of therapies cannot be given to the children. So we involve the children into kind of play-based activity and with the help of art therapy. Also, because the breadwinners are lost, there is economic burden on the families, and especially the wife, who becomes immediately the care provider and the provider of being at the center of all the problems. So this increases the societal pressures upon the families, and the household just become upside down. So we also use tailor-made advanced techniques, which are the neuro-linguistic programming. This is something which has been used primarily on the human rights defenders. We ourselves took this therapy because mostly we are also the victims of enforced disappearance. So this is something like if you put too much stress on a computer, it started to backfire and it doesn't work properly. Same as when we are burdening our minds and our souls with too much of grief, our bodies and our minds and hearts are unable to process that grief. For that grief, there is a therapy in which, and that is also very, very dear to us. So we just cannot part with that grief, because that grief is the memory of your loved one. So to keep that grief in somewhere which is also very, treasured place, and it was there, it will not be going anywhere, it will not be lost, but it will be compartmentalized. It will be put at a safe place where it will not affect your daily routine and your normalcy of your life. So this is the way psychologists treat us with, and it has been found to be a very, very effective therapy. So we all collectively were putting our griefs maybe in bundles, maybe in files, maybe in whatever way we can imagine our grief. And we were keeping it in the cupboards or in the safe places where we want to keep. But from that day onwards, that grief does not impact the daily life we want to live and the daily struggles which we have to take on.
Amina, I'm sorry, but could you, before the time runs out, could you say a little bit about how the psychosocial therapy and support empowers the women?
Yes, I'm coming towards that. So when these women get these therapies, they are converted into leaders and they are becoming the role models. So these women are taking care of their children, they are leading the struggles, and there's also a cultural shift in empowering women, because there are many ethnic movements which are going on in Pakistan, which are, with the help of these psychosocial therapies, these women are converted into leaders, and they are leading the struggles. So we also make use of role modeling. Like we present them with, in their psychosocial therapies, present them with the world over, like Maria Adela and different movements which are moving in world, and we give their examples to them, and that is how they also try to catch up with the role modeling. And similarly, the females, they also want to have a safe space. So in the safe space, they open up and they share everything, and they know that their memory will not be lost. And then we give them practical training for their capacity building and training of the trainers, that they become the psychologists, they become the care providers, and they become the trainers for others. So this is a continuous cycle which we are providing to the women, and after that, these women, their capacity has been built, and we also provide them with financial support, with seed money, with which they can build their capacities, and they can also conduct many financial projects for their families to survive their families with. So these are the methodologies which we take.
Thank you very much. At the very end, could you perhaps say what is then the best practices and positive experiences that you would like to sort of, in a nutshell, share with us?
Thank you. Yeah, the best practices which we have found out are the psychosocial therapies, which are tailor-made. For men, the men psychologists were engaged. For women, women psychologists were engaged. And children were engaged in art-based and play-based activities. Then there were motivational programs for women, in which they were converting their grief into energy. They were converting their grief into motivational struggles, which they had to advocate in future. Then many of our leading girls and women are now converted into leaders, and they are taking up the cause as provincial leaders, as coordinators, and working in different organizations apart from defense of human rights. And there's a community healing, which happens only when you are sitting in a community and you also have opportunity to kind of enjoy and have like a cup of tea or food or lunch. And that safe space is provided by Defense of Human Rights. And that's becoming a very, very important tool for us to take along and to convert the victims into activists. Then we also have rehabilitation for those who have come back from secret prisons, because they are, apart from being normal, they are not just mentally, but physically as well, they are not normal. So we rehabilitate them, and that has also become like, not just that families are reunited, but they are united with health, and they are also given rehabilitation. So by the time we are trying to give truth, justice, reparation, and closure to the families, the most important thing is that our services, with the help of United Nations Fund for Victims of Torture, are there. We are there for them forever. Like if this one psychosocial therapy is going to take 10, we are going to give it to them. If they are not going to be feeling well, we are going to give them 20 sessions. So we will never tell them that no, the sessions are over and we don't have now resources for your session. So that is something which gives them confidence and courage to move ahead. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Very inspiring presentation. We move to the last panelist, which is Ms. Anna Moyo, who is the Executive Director at the Center for the Study of Violence and Reconciliation, CSVR. And Ms. Moyo is also a human rights lawyer with extensive experience working in the legal, transitional justice, human rights, peace and security, gender, social justice, and violence prevention fields. Ms. Moyo has worked with African Union institutions supporting the development of soft law instruments in various capacities, and she is an expert trainer at national, regional, and continental level on human rights, transitional justice, peace building, and gender thematic areas. Anna, very welcome, and would you please share with us what kind of interventions that your MHPSS mental health psychosocial support efforts responses actually include?
Thank you, James. I also take this opportunity to thank the organizers of this meeting for inviting me to be here. At the Center for the Study of Violence and Reconciliation, the services that we provide include basically a number of interventions aimed at provision of psychosocial support to victims, from individual counseling sessions for individual victims to group sessions that include families of victims. Now we also branched out with some of the funding that we've received from Dignity since 2005 to now providing community healing, really trying to build community resilience to provision of psychosocial support and ensuring that there is a network for victims to rely on in their own personal spaces, be it at a family level, at a community level, and also in society. Because in most instances, when we look at individual counseling, this is a one-on-one session, and these sessions could be 10 sessions, could be 20 sessions, but at most you're looking at 1 to 2 hours per day between a victim and a therapist. And the majority of their time is spent in their families, in their communities. Sometimes this is where trauma is resident. So building that community resilience for families, for individuals, for victims is really key. So we have really moved in our approach to ensuring that the very communities where victims reside in or live in actually become part and parcel of the supportive network that they can rely on from time to time in their daily existence, basically, as they try to come to terms with the traumatic experience. And this is particularly important for victims of enforced disappearance, because you are talking about the trauma that is continuous, the trauma that has no date of ending anytime soon, as long as the missing, their disappeared family member is still, has not been found. And even sometimes in the event that perhaps the remains of the disappeared person are found, there is now basically another cycle of trauma associated with the loss that has now become real for the victim. So before the loved one is found either in life or perhaps in death, usually the victim lives in this limbo where one day you wake up, you feel, maybe let me have closure and accept that my loved one is no more. And the next day you wake up feeling, I should continue hoping. So it's basically being in this limbo, not knowing whether to give up or to continue hoping that one day you will find your loved one. And there is trauma associated with that. There's a different trauma that is associated with now grieving the disappeared person when the remains have been found. And all of this requires that we actually situate psychosocial support and the holding of the victim, the containment of the victim, not only in this one therapist that the victim will see periodically on specific appointments, but we must ensure that even the community, the home where the victim is, also provides this kind of support, the containment of the victim. That's why we moved to that. But we also realized with time, and this was also part of our growing the field of the services that we provide, the mental health and psychosocial support services that we provide to victims, to ensuring that at every level of interventions that victims initiate to try and address their traumatic experiences, be it in their quest for truth, in their quest for justice, in their quest for reparations, and even in ensuring that the state guarantees non-repetition or non-recurrence, that we integrate mental health and psychosocial support to all of these interventions. I think it has been said previously, the approach, Elba spoke about it, the trauma-informed approach to interventions that seek to aid victims in seeking justice, justice in whatever form that this justice means for victims. Victims may need a particular type of justice that has nothing to do with accountability. They may need closure, they may need to know the truth, which basically is one form of reparation, satisfaction. They may need basically to come to terms, or they may need to locate the remains of their loved ones so that they can give the remains a dignified burial for their closure. So whatever form this justice means, and the quest to finding this justice, all the different initiatives and interventions need to integrate psychosocial support, because with each level of intervention and initiative, the trauma is not put aside. The trauma is still present in the victim, in the life of the victim. And some of these interventions and initiatives are actually trauma-invoking. So the need to integrate psychosocial support in every stage, in every intervention or initiative is really important. And even some of the initiatives that are really aimed, that are positive and are aimed at ensuring closure for victims and memorializing the event that led to enforced disappearance and other gross human rights violations, such as memorialization, are also trauma-invoking. Of course, the paradox is that it's helping victims to move forward, but at the same time, it's also forcing them to relive the traumatic experience, because then you remember, in remembrance, the trauma also is resident. So this trauma-informed approach to interventions is part of what we are now advancing as CSVR, because we realize that trauma is always present. Sometimes it's present within the victim, it's present in their daily living, it's present around them. It's also present sometimes even amongst the very people who are providing services, the service providers, be it the lawyers, the investigators, who get to hear about the experiences of the victim. So even vicarious trauma is very real, and most of the service providers in the room, be it lawyers, be it investigators, documenters, can attest to this. There is trauma that is transferred that does not leave you the same as an intervener or a service provider. So addressing that is also important. And of course, I think it was said earlier in other panels that came before, even issues of dealing with intergenerational trauma. I think the paradox about trauma is that in most instances, the direct victims usually keep quiet about their experiences in the quest to try and shield the next generation from their own direct experiences, be it enforced disappearances. But the paradox is this, that the next generation becomes even more violent, and they don't understand why. And part of that is the trauma that has been passed down from one generation to the next, even in the silence or the silencing of the experiences to try and shield the next generation. So when we talk about the trauma-informed approaches, we are really addressing the different types of trauma that exist in society, in communities, in the families of victims, sometimes passed down unknowingly, sometimes passed down intentionally, and sometimes really passed down in the name of providing services and supporting or intervening so that victims can access justice. These are some of the interventions.
Thank you so much, Anna. Actually, I'd like to also mention that I'm proud to say that the fund has also supported the work of CSVR, which you just heard were able to share a lot of important experiences. My thanks goes to all four panelists. We were learning how to deal with enforced disappearances in a context where the conflict is forgotten and where the enforced disappearances are woven into sexual violence, sexual slavery, forced labor. How do you deal with it where you can't even track the cases here? You can use open sources and you can continue with stamina to track the women that disappeared. And you can use awareness and education in the communities about the concept of enforced disappearances and encouraging the hunt for the truth. We learned that in cases of litigation before the international judicial mechanisms, mainly the European Court of Human Rights, it's important to be fully aware of the need for informed consent, to inform the persons that consider litigation, to be aware of all the steps here, to assess what are actually the searches that have been undertaken by the states, and to respect a trauma-informed approach to have, like we heard also from Anna at the very end here, to have the psychosocial support included and thought into, integrated in all the steps of pursuing justice and types of reparation. We also heard how psychosocial support, if it maintains an empowerment component, can actually contribute to the process from victim to activist and could empower women into leadership roles, take responsibility and be able to empower themselves and others. So I think, and maybe mention at the very end, we heard in the previous session about the continuing crime of enforced disappearances. Now we also heard about the continuing trauma of enforced disappearances. And obviously these two are tied well together, because the continuing trauma that applies as long as there's no truth is what justifies that it's a continuing crime. So these two things are very close together. I think we have just a few minutes for an intervention. At least there is one from the International Group for Missing Persons, and there might be time for one more. Please.
Yes.
No? Yes, now. Excellencies, dear panelists, dear colleagues, I speak today on behalf of the Global Alliance for the Missing, consisting of Argentina, Azerbaijan, Colombia, Croatia, Estonia, Kuwait, Mexico, Nigeria, Norway, Peru, Republic of Korea, Switzerland, and the Gambia. Members of the Global Alliance for the Missing have committed to joint diplomatic efforts to ensure that preventing and responding to the occurrence of missing persons, including enforced disappearances, remains a focus on the international agenda. In the 2 years that the Global Alliance has been active, it has sought to reiterate in several fora the importance of preventing and responding to the occurrence of missing persons, and the need to keep the families of missing persons central in any processes relating to their missing relatives. As a group, we had the opportunity to hear from families of missing persons at the 3rd ICRC International Conference of Families of Missing Persons in November 2023. Families told us how much they need and search for answers, how essential for them it is to know the fate and the whereabouts of their loved ones. They also told us how vital it is for them to get justice. They described the emotional suffering of living with the absence of a loved one and how it is compounded by the daily administrative, legal, and economic burdens. We heard the same from the panelists today. In addition to economic security, mental health, and psychological support, it is important that states put in place a legal framework that provides a status of a missing person so that their families are not faced with administrative and legal hurdles. Families of missing persons are not only victims, they are also often the first to search for and seek answers on behalf of their loved ones. And in many instances, they also advocate for their needs and therefore influence and participate in relevant processes. Engaging more proactively with families' associations and where needed, providing them assistance and support to formalize informally convened groups is one way of ensuring continued engagement based on the local context and needs. The Global Alliance for the Missing remains committed to listening and learning on the multifaceted needs and agency of the families of missing persons, including those aspects related to enforced disappearances, in order to enhance the group's advocacy on what continues to be a pressing concern in the international domain. I thank you.
Thank you very much. For this intervention. I look at the organizers, and here we have time for one question, just one question, and then we'll switch to the second panel. There's a lady up there with a white scarf.
على المداخلات القيمة خاصة فيما يتعلق الصدمة المتوارثة عبر الأجيال أو المتنقلة عبر الأجيال. أريد أن أشارك فيما يتعلق بضحايا الاختطاف القسري بالجزائر، وتحديدا الجيل الثاني أبناء المختطفين الذين يتوارثون الصدمة. وأردت أن أعرف هل بالنسبة لكم تم إشراك الأبناء في النضال، وهل هذا الأمر كان نتائجه جيدة أو على العكس من ذلك؟ لأنه فيما يتعلق لنا بالجزائر الكثير من الأمهات وحماية لأبنائهن أبعدنهن عن المطالبة أو المتابعة لقضية أبائهم. وللأسف الشديد وبحكم أنني مختصة نفسية عيادية لاحظت أن إغفال هذا الجانب تسبب في أزمات نفسية للأبناء، خاصة منها الإجهاد ما بعد الصدمة، الاكتئاب، نوبات الهلع، وأخطر من ذلك الإدمان على المخدرات. كل الأبناء تقريبا يعيشون حالة نكران أو إنكار لحالة اختطاف آبائهم، وهذا أثر بشكل كبير على صحتهم النفسية. هل هناك أعمال في هذا الاتجاه؟ وهل هناك إمكانية في التشبيك بين مختلف منظمات ضحايا عائلات المختطفين من أجل الرفع من معاناة هذه الفئة تحديدا؟ وشكرا لكم.
Thank you very much. I think we have time for one answer only. Who will volunteer for this? Hala, perhaps? Sure. Or Amina? Or both?
Thank you so much for your intervention. Yes, the trauma does inherits to the next generation, because the mother is living with this trauma, and then obviously she's surrounded with her family and kids. So it is actually found in 3 generations. The parents of the disappeared, then the spouse of the disappeared, then the children. So all the 3 generations are identified with trauma and signs of PTSD. And even when it gets worse and it's not treated on time and not proper handling is given to the family, they are suicidal inclinations as well. And many diseases originate from depression, from living with this trauma and depression for long. So it leads to physical diseases as well. So that is why it is becoming more and more important for, not just for the families of the disappeared, but for everyone to assess themselves for mental health. And we have found such children who have been recovered completely from trauma because of proper handling. And your question was also that if they are seeking refuge in different kinds of, applying to different sorts of, I don't know what to say in that. But anyhow, I have not found any other children, so far in my experience, who have depended on other means. Yes, they have behavioral issues, but they don't start depending on other medication or anything. They go for peace, like as you mentioned.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Anna, very briefly, please.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for that question. In our experience, I come from South Africa, and where we still have some cases of enforced disappearance stemming from the unfinished business of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in South Africa. And our experience is basically with children, children of parents who have not sought trauma counseling or who have not sought psychosocial support in most instances, and we have a lot of this in South Africa. In fact, some of the research that CSVR has done when we are trying to probe the question, why is South Africa so violent? Most of it is the trauma, the unresolved trauma of the past that parents never sought psychosocial support services for, and the children are angrier, they are more violent. They are violent in schools and so forth. And when you really get down to why the children are so violent, they have seen parents modeling a certain behavior because of the trauma that is unresolved, that they have not dealt with. Either the parents become angry, they are not sociable, and so forth. So you almost have a parent who's present but not present, basically because they are traumatized. And this leads to children actually sort of inheriting that trauma and literally living that trauma out. And I think I can just end with this example that we have, whereby in one instance, one survivor during apartheid spoke about how they wanted to shield their children from the traumatic experience and never spoke about the fact that the mother disappeared during apartheid. And the children, although the parent never spoke about these issues, and the children got adopted by another family member and sort of became the children of this different family member. But the children were so affected and they were so angry at the parent because they're saying, we are seeing you numb, you never spoke about these experiences, but our neighbors spoke about it. We heard bits and pieces of what happened from other people and became so angry. So as a result, the children became unruly in school, they became bullies and so forth. When now we try to say, let's trace where all of this came from, it's really coming from the children now opening up saying, I know this is what happened, but no one is telling me the truth. Therefore, it becomes behavior in children. So some of that passing down of the trauma is really, it ends up literally being, that trauma ends up being lived by the children. And again, parents may be thinking that we are shielding the children, but really the children end up being victims of that very same trauma, even though it's not spoken about. So the need really for psychosocial support services for direct victims, including their families, is really important and key. And in most of our interventions, when we meet a direct victim, we ask as well that other family members become recipients of the very same services, so that there can be an environment created in the home that literally holds everyone together and identifies everyone as a victim of that particular traumatic experience, because everyone gets affected, whether we speak about it or not.
Thank you very much. Please join me in applauding the 4 panelists, because we now need to change. So we sit behind and we leave space for the new panel.
Okay. I'm the first. Oh, yeah.
No, I will.
It's in Spanish.
Hello, everyone. So now we are going to the last session of today. I'm truly honored to moderate this session with very strong and courageous women human rights defenders and families of victims who dedicate themselves to protect and support other families. For the first panelist, you want to use this? Yeah, for the first panelist, yep. Maria Adela Antarkulis. Okay, sorry. Okay. Is it okay?
Is it open?
Maria Adela, she's the Executive Secretary of Latin American Federation of Families of Detained or Disappeared Persons of FEDIFEM. She also be the Vice President of the Association of Mothers of the Presider Mayor Argentina and President of the International Coalition Against Enforced Disappearances, or EHRAC. Maria, could you please explain why it is important to listen to the outcry of the families?
Muchas gracias además por la invitación a estar aquí. Yo lo siento con una gran alegría, mezclada como siempre con una gran pena, como todos nuestros encuentros, todas nuestras reflexiones. Siempre la mitad es estímulo y alegría y la mitad es la memoria que nos recuerda en qué estamos, ¿verdad? Yo he venido con el retrato de mi hermano, está colgado afuera. Mi hermano era Daniel Antocolets, un profesor de Derecho Internacional Público, experto en relaciones internacionales y que hubiera podido, creo, estar aquí si no hubieran mutilado su vida, hubiera podido aportar su conocimiento como profesional y como defensor de derechos. Yo me voy a limitar aprovechando la importancia del acento que se está poniendo en el empoderarnos a nosotros, familiares, y a quienes tienen un interés legítimo en las y los desaparecidos, voy a inventar un poco un prototipo de figuras. Una de las figuras es la víctima, la otra es el funcionario, the official. Aquella persona y aquel conjunto de personas de los gobiernos que forman parte de comisiones de la memoria, de sistemas de búsqueda. Y, por supuesto, voy a terminar pidiendo a todos quienes estamos reunidos aquí, especialmente a los gobiernos y a los funcionarios de los gobiernos del mundo, que pongan el acento en la formación y la capacitación de las funcionarias que tienen que realizar las búsquedas. He pensado en varias diferencias entre esas dos figuras principales, en cierto modo prototipos en los cuales pienso la víctima y el funcionario. Siempre que diga el funcionario estoy incorporando a todos los géneros, a todas las variedades de géneros. Pienso, por ejemplo, en la responsabilidad. Los perpetradores son absoluta y totalmente responsables cuando, por supuesto, se demuestra su crimen. Y me pregunto, los funcionarios que no cumplen con su deber, que dejan vacías las tareas de una comisión de búsqueda, de un sistema de búsqueda, les cabe, y pienso que tenemos que reflexionarlo, les cabe también responsabilidad en este crimen que se llevó a mi hermano y a los hermanos y familiares de tantos miles, tantos centenares de miles de compañeros que sufrieron un crimen de ejecución continua. Un funcionario que hoy no cumple con su deber, ¿qué responsabilidad tiene en el delito de desaparición forzada? Creo que me hago más preguntas que enuncio certezas, ¿verdad? Hay mucha literatura, incluso pienso yo que probablemente Daniel, mi hermano, haya sido arrojado en Buenos Aires, como tantos otros, tantas decenas y quizá centenares de compañeros, al Río de la Plata. Los arrojaban después de ponerles una inyección que los dormía, en los famosos, y por cierto, cuyos responsables en parte están condenados a reclusión perpetua, en los famosos vuelos de la muerte. Las aguas remiten a nuestros orígenes. Sepultar, esconder el crimen de la desaparición forzada, hacer desaparecer la desaparición forzada en esas aguas es también atentar contra la propia condición de vida que todos los seres tenemos, no solo los seres humanos, y mucho más en la responsabilidad los seres humanos, ¿verdad? Muchas veces hemos hablado entre compañeros y compañeras de la primera pregunta, una de las primeras preguntas de la humanidad plasmada en la Biblia, cuando se dice que el creador de todo, de toda la vida, le pregunta a un criminal que es Caín, que había asesinado a su hermano, cuando le pregunta, Caín, ¿dónde está tu hermano? Es una pregunta que conforma, en cierto modo, nuestra identidad. El estatuto de la verdad es otro de los puntos. ¿Qué modo de mostrar la verdad? Si el funcionario no aprende a tener un informe diferencial, si no comprende que la persona con la cual tiene que trabajar o la familia con la cual tiene que trabajar quizá no posee un lenguaje adecuado, quizá puede mostrarse agresiva, quizá lo que hace es silencio. ¿Qué verdad comprende el funcionario? Los estados tienen que trabajar la forma como un funcionario que está obligado a trabajar con familias y a buscar los restos o ojalá con vida al detenido desaparecido, como decimos en la Argentina, detenido por fuerzas que dirige el Estado, que si no aprende un enfoque diferencial de respeto a los modos en que el familiar puede decir su verdad, ¿cuál es la verdad que recibe el funcionario? La conciencia del horror y del terror. Creo que en general los funcionarios que tienen que trabajar en la búsqueda en tantos órganos recientemente creados en México, en Chile, en Colombia un poco antes, quienes tienen que trabajar en la búsqueda del desaparecido conocen perfectamente el horror del cual se ha impregnado su país, toda la sociedad de su país. Conoce el terror que se ha impartido, el familiar conoce el horror y lo vive como puede en su persona. El trauma y el cuidado que hay que tener, hay una realidad. Los familiares, pero también los funcionarios de un país, todos vivimos las consecuencias de la represión. Sea represión de dictaduras, sea represión de gobiernos sin valores, gobiernos autoritarios elegidos por la mayoría del pueblo. Puedo decir abiertamente que en este momento, al menos yo, creo que muchos miles de personas más, estamos sufriendo, reviviendo traumas ante medidas del actual gobierno de mi país contra los equipos que tienen que trabajar y que han trabajado tan eficazmente y durante tanto tiempo en la búsqueda de datos, en la búsqueda de la verdad para ponerla al servicio de una justicia constitucional. Ese trauma hace que cada familiar busque sus propios aliados e intente presentar al funcionario sus aliados. ¿Y quiénes son sus aliados? Quizá un vendedor de diarios, quizá un enterrador de cementerios, quizá un joven soldado, hoy mucho mayor en la Argentina, que supo ver cosas tremendas, crímenes tremendos, que se vio obligado a callar y que por fin también se presenta o también la acompaña al familiar a denunciar para la búsqueda de verdad y justicia. Hay que apurarse.
May I turn to this? May I ask you more about your experiences? Just close the mic.
Okay.
May I ask you, because you have a lot of experiences working you are in the part of the network for national level and regional and globally like EHRAC. So how you can do that? How you can work to create the network? Could you give us like for some example of the successful strategies of the family to participation to create the strong network as for your experiences? Because I think that to create the network, you should have faced some challenges and maybe obstacles, but how can you do that? Could you please share the experiences of yourself and your network?
The translation is in French. I don't understand the translation.
The translation is in French, not Spanish.
How do I work with families and how do I work? It's different the way, no, it's different the way, no, voy a hablar en castellano, mi inglés es muy somero. ¿Sí? Es diferente el estadio que vivimos los familiares en los diferentes países. En la Argentina hemos, desde hace bastantes años, desde hace más de 40 años, hemos estado pasando y viviendo en las causas y las consecuencias del surgimiento de un poderoso movimiento de derechos humanos. Ese movimiento, y aquí hay compañeros, compañeras que pertenecen a ese movimiento fuerte de derechos humanos, hemos conseguido avanzar con visitas personales, con pequeñas manifestaciones en ciudades, con grandes manifestaciones a medida que lográbamos que sindicalistas, grupos de docentes, de maestros, jóvenes de la universidad y también de los colegios secundarios han ido comprendiendo nuestro reclamo de verdad sobre lo sucedido a nuestros familiares y de justicia ante tribunales, los tribunales propios de nuestro país, no tribunales especiales. Ese movimiento de derechos humanos en el cual las madres, las abuelas de Plaza de Mayo, la Asociación de Familiares de Desaparecidos y Detenidos por Razones Políticas, muchas personas individuales que entienden y que sienten lo mismo que los familiares, hemos ido logrando redes, a veces trabajando solo dentro de ciudades y a veces entre ciudades. Yo reconozco que hay rincones en nuestro país donde los familiares no reciben, por supuesto, la visita del Estado, pero tampoco reciben nuestra visita, por muchas razones. Pero en general, en el país pudo conformarse un firme movimiento en el cual las madres, las abuelas, los familiares estuvimos. Encabezándolo, no lo sé, son los más conocidos. En mi país, la defensa de derechos humanos encuentra una simbolización especialmente en las madres de Plaza de Mayo y en las abuelas de Plaza de Mayo. Entonces, como yo trabajo fuertemente en una federación de familiares de toda América Latina, en FEDEFAM, comprendemos perfectamente que una señora, una compañera salvadoreña, camina por la calle rumbo a un acto donde puede correr junto con sus compañeros y compañeras bastante peligro, y quienes se dan cuenta de la reunión no las aplauden, no las elogian, no les agradecen, no las estimulan. Una madre de Plaza de Mayo va al teatro y alguien sabe entre los espectadores que esa señora que está allí, muy mayor, es una abuela o una madre, y la gente se pone de pie y aplaude. Entonces, ¿qué regla hay que imponer o proponer? Hace mucho que con las madres, con las abuelas que son nuestras hermanas y con otros familiares, sabemos y tomamos como propia una frase de políticos. La frase es muy sencilla. La política, dicen muchos, es una larga paciencia. El trabajo por verdad y por justicia es una larga paciencia, tal vez. Quizá el único consejo que pueda permitirme dar en distintas latitudes es la insistencia de que llevamos nuestra verdad y de que debemos tener mucho coraje y una larga paciencia.
Thank you.
Okay. Muchas gracias.
Gracias, Maria Adela. You are very inspiring. May I turn to our second panelist from the Sri Lanka, Mrs. Gopalakrishnan and Mrs. Ananda Dadarasha. Mr. Gopalakrishnan is currently attached to the Embassy of Switzerland, Colombo, as the Senior National Programs Officer for the Peace and Human Rights Division of the Swiss, assigned to work mainly in the former conflict zone, northeast of Sri Lanka. And Mrs. Ananda Nadaraja, she's one of the senior women leaders and activists working with the families of enforced disappearances in Sri Lanka since 2017. She has played a crucial role in her capacity as a secretary in strengthening the then newly created Association of the Relative of Enforced Disappearances, or we call ARED. That is the network of the representative of the families of enforced disappearances in the northern and eastern provinces, which is the former war zone in Sri Lanka. May I ask both of you for the first question about the, as the situation in Sri Lanka is very challenging. May I ask both of you why and how the network of the families was established? Please.
Families of the network.
Vanakkam, all of you. First of all, I wish to thank you, the committee for the World Congress, to giving me this chance. We are in continuous protest from 2017, but we lost our disappeared loved ones in 2009 onwards. From 2009, we fight and for our justice in every district individually. After some period, they gathered in one group in a district. Like that, every district, we gathered every district level and protested there. Some time later, there are we have formed committees in every district, and we look after our protest and other works. In 2017, we have guided by Mannar Citizen Committee and also the Swiss Embassy, and all mothers planned and selected our committee members, and all together we formed a consortium. In addition to, I have to mention that before we elected the consortium in Kilinochchi district protesters planned to start a continuous protest on February 20th, 2017. Accordingly, we started the protest. For the protest, in other 8 districts, victims, that women leaders came to our place and supported us. In the meantime, the Swiss Embassy led us to empower our women leaders by specialized officers from another countries who very fond of with victims and very intelligent person and she's an expert. She trained us and she built up our capacity building. According to that, we get we got empowered, and we find our own protests. In Kilinochchi, first we started the protest. Later, there are protests started at Mullathievu, Vaunia, Tringomala, and Jaffna, Marthangani. In the meantime, Swiss Embassy helped us to call Colombo and had a meeting with the people who are in the north and east, and also other districts in Sri Lanka. There must be some happiness between the victims, because between the south people and north and east people. But after some period, we trust each other and we love them, because all they are victims similar as like us. So they trust us and also we trust them. There was a good friendship was there. And we talked to each other and helped each other and build up a good network because of the Swiss Embassy. After that only, we could have realized that they are not responsible for our loved ones' disappearance. They also lost their loved ones by the war. So now there is a good mutual understanding, and we discuss each other in where it is necessary and take decisions on behalf of that discussion, and we carrying our protest and other activities. Because of this network, we have achieved so many things. Likewise, there are another network like in North and East, that is also very important, because in 8 districts we gathered all together and made a consortium. That's why we met diplomats and demands our requirements, and after that only they gave attention for our requirements. Earlier, we couldn't demand our request because all are individuals and we couldn't bargain or we couldn't stress our demands. So our network is now also functioning as well. What else? Okay, thank you.
So, do you want to add more?
Just to add, you're from the region, so you may aware that Sri Lanka had experienced different waves of enforced disappearances since 1970s. So even during that period, we had Mothers Front, particularly in the southern part of Sri Lanka, where at that time Sri Lanka had largest number of enforced disappearances. But over the decades, that network slightly kind of paused and then became, then the attention shifted to the other region of Sri Lanka, particularly because what happened during the last phase of the war in the island. I would just like to highlight one point. The Mothers Front in the south has been very active, but somehow since the end of the last phase of the war, because of the nature of the disappearances that took place in one part of the country, the quantity of the victims, plus, salute to all the mothers in that region who actually made a point to raise their voices against the enforced disappearances. Somehow, the attention shifted to one side of the enforced disappearances in the country since 2009. And what the Swiss, the Peace and Human Rights Division of the Swiss FTFA wanted to do since 2012, that we have been directly working with all communities in Sri Lanka, is to make sure that the women leaders across the country comes together to amplify their voices for a common demand to address the legacy of enforced disappearances in Sri Lanka. And that's the role that the Swiss PHRD has been playing since 2012 in terms of network building across the country.
May I ask a very short question? How can the Swiss embassy protect the families of the victims?
How can
the embassy protect the families, the families of the victims?
That's a very difficult question to answer. Well, I would say protection is a very broad language for us. It functions at different levels. Certain things are very explicit, certain things are very confidential. But with the thematic interventions on enforced disappearances, since 2012, the Peace and Human Rights Division of the Swiss FTFA somehow has prioritized the enforced disappearances as one of their core mandate in Sri Lanka. Now, under that, we have been working at different levels with different actors. But with the families of the disappeared, when it comes to protection, I think it differs time to time, it differs incident to incident. At large, through our association, through our collaboration with the wide range of the women leaders across the country, there is a strong message. It's a political message that has been shared at the national level, at the international level, that when an international community, a very strong international community representative is working directly with the families across the country, they are being protected. Right, so that's the general message. But however, on a daily basis, at different circumstances, different levels, when the women leaders are in need for some form of protection from the Swiss embassy, those are being timely addressed according to the needs.
Thank you very much. So regarding to the limited time, may I turn to the our last speakers. We have Ms. Elba Mastorik-Nikovic. Elba is the Senior Officer of for Civil Society Initiative in the Western Balkans Program at the International Commission on Missing Persons, or ICMP. In this role, she worked extensively with the families of missing persons, advocating for their rights to know whereabouts of their loved one. Elba is dedicating to enhancing the capacities of civil society organizations, especially associations representing victims' family in Bosnia and Herzegovina and across the Western Balkan region. I'm very honored to have another woman on this panel, Ms. Semina Alekit. Sorry if I'm wrongly pronounced your name. She's the president of Association of Families of the Missing in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And may I ask Elma, how does how you can explain how ICMP support and empowers Association of Families of Missing in the Western Balkans and advocate for their rights, please?
Thank you very much. It is both a great pleasure, but also a great responsibility to be on the panel with all these amazing women. I do hope that some of the experiences and good practices that Semina and I share with you today would help you in your future work, which I believe focuses on securing the rights of families of the missing. So, International Commission on Missing Persons, ICMP, is a treaty-based intergovernmental organization that works to ensure cooperation of governments and others to locate, identify missing persons, but also to investigate their disappearance, whether they are missing from war, human rights abuses, or regular migration, natural disasters, so basically any other set of circumstances where persons go missing for involuntary reasons. As the only international organization exclusively tasked to deal with the missing persons issue, ICMP has to date assisted more than 40 countries affected by this extremely painful and complicated issue by applying or trying to apply a system that was developed in the Western Balkans, specifically the countries of the former Yugoslavia, after the conflicts of the 90s. This integrated system combines the establishment of dedicated institutions and legislation to address the missing persons issue, the use of modern scientific methods in the process of identification of victims, and last but not least, or I would say the most important, the active engagement of families of the missing in the process. You will have to agree with me that families of the missing and their active engagement is crucial in achieving truth and justice. And ICMP is proud of the fact that it has played an important role in helping them in their efforts, I have to say, across the globe, as many of you here can confirm. On the other side, helping families to create, helping states, to create structured framework for families of the missing, to seek and provide information, to donate reference samples for DNA analysis, to receive legal support. ICMP ensures that governments are held accountable for respecting the rights of families of the missing to know the truth and to seek justice.
Thank you very much, Elma. And may I ask how families of the missing from different communities in the Western Balkans manage to establish and foster dialogue and collaboration?
Yes. My position at ICMP entails working with families of the missing, promoting the family's right to know by working to develop and strengthen the capacities of civil society organizations, primarily associations of victims' families in the Western Balkans region. And ICMP started working with families in the Western Balkans right after the conflict, so it was 1997. through different programs aimed at their, we supported them through different programs aimed at their empowerment. And since then, families of the missing have implemented hundreds, if not thousands, of projects related to advocacy activities, outreach activities, awareness raising, networking, and so on. And maybe to better answer this question, I will just give you a few examples. When we are talking about the advocacy activities pertaining to the realization of rights of families of the missing, countries of the former Yugoslavia have been pioneers in the creation of a legal framework regulating the investigation and identification of missing persons cases. Bosnia and Herzegovina was the first country in the world to adopt 2004 law on missing persons, followed by Kosovo in 2011 and Croatia in 2019, while Serbia and Montenegro, they based their investigations on legal principles outlined in several other laws, such as the Criminal Code and the Criminal Procedure Code. But what I'm trying to say is that none of this would be possible if the families of the missing from different contexts, only in Bosnia and Herzegovina we have several different contexts, have not decided to come together and to make their countries respect their losses. And ICMP is proud of the fact that it has empowered them to the level so they can be part of each and every part of the process, including the preparation of these laws, ensuring that the content aligns with the needs of families of the missing, or I will not say needs, with the rights of families of the missing. If I have time, I can give you another example related to, let's say, outreach activities to encourage active participation of families of the missing in the process of search and identification of victims. When the role of the modern scientific methods in the process of identification was presented to families of the missing, they committed themselves to disseminating information of the importance of the DNA analysis in the process of investigation. As a result of their commitment, of their work, more than 100,000 family members voluntarily provided reference samples to ICMP to help in the identification of their loved ones. And as a result of that, 75% of around 40,000 missing persons that were reported missing after the conflicts have been identified. And this is truly unprecedented. This is, yeah, but we are proud of this.
Thank you very much, Elba. I think that regarding to times, we can have maybe one question from the floor. So, okay, we can have two. First from you in front, and then the second, the ladies. Yeah, so please. Please.
Is it open?
Thank you. Okay, thank you. My question is really around, sorry about that. My question is around the concept of empowerment. I think this might be a question that's probably geared towards maybe Elba, but anyone else is free to take it as well. A Sikh human rights organization identified and documented 5,298 Sikh youth that were killed in India by the Indian state. There was mass cremations, a lot of, let's say, injustice and torture and repression that many other people in many other parts of the world have seen as well. It's thought that like justice is a form of empowerment. But in countries like India, where there's political interference, weak judicial systems, corruption, victim intimidation, lack of international cooperation, and And that leads to things like the erosion of trust in institutions, perpetuation of that same violence, human rights violations that continue on, as we've talked about here, that the continuation of these enforced disappearances is a violation of the law as well. We were told in activist spaces, and I'm speaking from the Sikh community as an activist in a leadership role, we're told to talk about strengthening legal frameworks, engaging in independent judiciaries, international cooperation. But where my question comes in is that much of what I've said can be summed up as a lack of political will, nationally and internationally, to act. Many countries that are undertaking this type of repression and enforced disappearances, they themselves cover these things up, or there's a lack of will on their behalf to actually do anything. Internationally, they do it to cover up their own crimes. Internationally, we have other nations that should be holding them to account, and either through diplomatic ties or economic ties, they don't do that either. So when you have powerful countries, like I'm referencing India, who has one of the worst human rights records in the world, 109th out of 160 countries, one of the worst press freedoms in the world, so you can't even get media or freedom, press freedom by RSF, one of the sponsors of this organization. India is 159th out of 180th in those freedoms. In your opinion or experience, how can victims of enforced disappearances, human rights violations, genocide expect to defend themselves and empower themselves outside of the generic means of going to reaction? Is there anything beyond empowerment that is in the justice or legal system that we've talked about today here? All of this applies to impunity as well. Impunity reigns because there's a lack of political will of countries, especially in the West, that calls themselves the defenders of human rights, looking at countries that they themselves have colonized and imperialized over the last several hundred years and created this mess in the first place, a lack of political will on their part because they're still exploiting those countries. So my question is really around that. How do we empower people when the most vulnerable and the most victimized amongst us are still at the bottom of the barrel?
May I, yes, for the next question, the ladies. Yeah, please.
Bonjour, je suis Célia, défenseur de droits de l'humain tamoul, collectif de femmes de droits pour les droits de l'homme. J'aimerais poser une question à Maria. J'aimerais savoir, autant que famille de victimes de disparition forcée en militant contre les violations des droits de l'humain, dans votre parcours, quel a été le rôle de la diaspora d'Argentins vivant à l'étranger sur tous les Argentins vivant en Europe? Autant que vivant en Europe, en tant que membre de la diaspora tamoul, je constate que nous sommes souvent confrontés à des défis similaires. Nous sommes divisés par les pays occidentaux, comme la Suisse, qui restreint notre droit de travail et continue de stigmatiser notre communauté. Avez-vous des conseils ou des réflexions sur la manière dont une diaspora peut surmonter ces divisions et jouer un rôle plus actif et plus unifié dans la lutte contre les droits de l'homme? Merci.
Thank you very much. So we have one question for Maria Adela, and the next question, who want to respond? For the first question, who want to respond?
For the first?
Yeah.
I haven't understood the question of that girl, because that is the problem.
Irma, do you want to respond, or maybe the experience in Sri Lanka in the conflict area?
No, I need a Spanish translator. No, she didn't.
In Sri Lanka, even now, there are very threats to victims, victimized mothers and their families. So we are very disturbing by those challenges, and we have to face those challenges with very powerful methods. So we need empowerment for our women leaders time to time to face those challenges. So we have to solution for that. In future, we must sort out the solution for that.
My problem is that I speak English, but I don't understand the questions in English. But there is a certainty. We can't work in a bubble. Enforced disappearances? Okay. Enforced disappearance is not, can be worked in a bubble because we depend absolutely on the social, political, and economical conditions by which a country develops or not, goes forward or not, va hacia adelante, sigo en castellano, avanza o no avanza. Nosotros lo que pedimos es gobiernos fuertes y no gobiernos fuertes, gobiernos con medidas de fuerte presencia del Estado. No podemos avanzar ante gobiernos que destrozan las instituciones del Estado y que desamparan de esa forma la posibilidad de reunión, de comunicación y de traslado de los familiares para irse volviendo más fuerte. Creo que no contesto bien la pregunta de usted, pero si tiene que ver con cómo avanzar por nuestra cuenta como un sistema paralelo, no podemos. Dependemos totalmente. Tenemos que adecuar nuestros procedimientos al gobierno bajo el cual estamos caminando. De ahí la importancia de los procesos electorales, la importancia de a quién se elige para gobernar un país y la importancia de seguir comprendiendo que el trabajo en derechos humanos no es un trabajo partidario, es un trabajo que abarca campos mucho más extensos que los partidos políticos, aunque también dependemos de la existencia de partidos políticos. No sé si es así o no la respuesta. Chicas, ustedes.
Gracias, Maria Aguilar. I think time's up, so that I want to conclude this session. Before concluding this session, I want to say that I'm very humble to sit among really powerful women human rights defenders. And I would like to sincerely thank to all the women for their courage and dedication in supporting the families of victims of enforced disappearance to create a network. As you know, when someone disappears, it spreads fear throughout the entire communities, leaving families, often women and children, isolated and vulnerable. So building the network for families of the disappeared is essential, not only to support them in access to justice, but also to empower victims to stand on their own and overcome fear. So once again, thank you very much on the very powerful women human rights defenders. Thank you.
Thank you to you, Hala. Thank you.